My name is Winifred Clark, and I will never forget the moment my father shattered the last fragile piece of our family. In the middle of a crowded courtroom, he leaned across the table, slapped my mother so hard the crack froze every breath in the room, and hissed through his teeth, "You've been useless your whole life! Just die already!" For 29 years, I had watched him humiliate her behind closed doors. But hearing those words, seeing that hand rise in front of a judge, in front of me, was different. It was the kind of wound that doesn't bruise the skin, but splits the soul wide open. I stood, placed my green beret on the witness table like a gavel, and said the words that would change everything. "Your Honor, please turn to the last page." The air inside the Fulton County courtroom was thick, stale, and suffocating, as if the walls themselves had absorbed years of bitterness. The faint scent of old varnish and wax polish clung to the wooden benches. I sat rigid, every muscle tense, my eyes locked on the front where my mother's hands trembled over the divorce papers. Then it happened. My father leaned forward with a look of contempt that chilled the room, and without hesitation, his hand shot across the table. The sound of the slap cracked through the air like a gunshot. My mother's head jerked to the side, her cheek blooming red, while his voice followed, low and venomous. "You've been useless your whole life. Just die already." For a moment, silence smothered the room. The clerk stopped typing. Even the bailiff stiffened, his hand drifting closer to his holster. Every gaze froze on the small, broken figure of my mother, still reeling from the blow. Rage boiled in my chest, but it wasn't the wild kind. It was cold, sharpened by years of watching this man grind her spirit down behind closed doors. I rose slowly, the scrape of the chair legs loud in the stillness. My movements were deliberate, measured. With both hands, I removed the green beret from my head and placed it firmly on the witness table. The soft thud landed like a gavel striking wood, carrying more weight than any outburst could. My voice cut through the hush, steady and unshaken. "Your Honor, please turn to the last page." Every head swiveled toward me. The judge adjusted his glasses, curiosity sharpening his tired expression. My father spun in his seat, his face draining of color, confusion twisting into unease. No one else in that room knew it yet, but I had come prepared. The final page was more than a piece of paper. It was a weapon I had forged long before this day. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, waiting to erupt, and in that suspended moment, the story I had carried for decades began to unfold. Atlanta's suburbs looked ordinary to anyone passing by. Neat lawns, quiet cul-de-sacs. But inside our house, the imbalance was constant and corrosive. Christmas morning told the story best. Graham tore into the wrapping paper and whooped when he found a gleaming pair of rollerblades waiting under the tree. I opened my own box and stared down at a plastic toy kitchen, pink and flimsy. The message was loud even to a 10-year-old. Boys get to move fast. Girls stay in the kitchen. It never stopped there. When I brought home a report card covered in straight A's, I handed it over with a flutter of pride in my chest. My father barely glanced at it before tossing it onto the counter, already shifting his attention to the stack of bills. "Good," he muttered, as if I'd done nothing more than take out the trash. That same night, Graham stormed in with a speeding ticket in his hand. Instead of scolding, my father chuckled, clapped him on the shoulder, and said the words that cut me more deeply than any punishment. "Boys will be boys." He paid the fine the next day as if it were a badge of honor. It was then I began to understand. No matter how hard I worked, no matter how flawless I tried to be, it would never matter. Graham was the son, the pride, the future. I was a burden. That realization lodged inside me like a splinter I could never pull out. The worst part wasn't even my father's dismissal. It was my mother's silence. She'd slip into my room at night, carrying a plate of cookies, brushing my hair back from my forehead as if that could undo the sting. "Don't mind him," she whispered once, her eyes tired and pleading. "He's just old-fashioned. He doesn't mean it." But he did. And her excuses felt like another betrayal. In protecting herself, she left me standing alone. That silence carved out a loneliness far heavier than the slap of indifference. It was the middle of a sweltering Georgia summer, when everything in me hardened. I was in the garage, sweat slicking my palms as I gripped the pull-up bar I'd mounted between the rafters. Each repetition was a rebellion, each strained breath a refusal to be small. The door creaked open, and there he was, my father, silhouetted in the yellow porch light, his face twisted in disgust. "What the hell are you doing?" he barked. "You look like a damn freak. A gorilla. Go put on a dress before you embarrass yourself." Shame burned in my throat, but I didn't cry. Not this time. I dropped from the bar, walked past him without a word, and shut myself in my room. My laptop screen glowed in the dark as I typed 3 words into the search bar. Hardest jobs for women. What came up wasn't just a list, it was a lifeline. Soldiers, medics, rangers. Paths that demanded more than strength. They demanded endurance, grit, silence in the face of doubt. That night, I made my choice. Months later, standing in the dust of a training field, I heard the voice that would shape me. Sergeant Ellis, weathered and unshakable, looked me dead in the eye. "Stop trying to prove it with your mouth," he said. "Prove it by doing the work. That's all that matters." Those words fused to my bones, a code I carried into every trial that followed. When I finally told my mother, she broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she grabbed my wrists. "Don't go! Winnie! The world will chew you up." I almost faltered, until she exhaled, sagging in surrender, and whispered the line that would echo through my life. "If you go, at least become strong in a way your father will never understand." Her plea wasn't permission. It was a blessing wrapped in fear. And from that night forward, it became the compass I would never set down. Fort Benning, in midsummer, was a furnace. The air heavy with humidity, and the red Georgia clay clinging to our boots like a second skin. I had come there to prove I belonged, but the men around me had already decided I didn't. They called me the Barbie medic, smirking behind my back, wagering how long before I washed out. Day after day, I pushed through the grueling routine, dragging bodies twice my weight across dirt fields, jamming IVs into simulated casualties while my hands shook from exhaustion, hauling a 60-pound rucksack over punishing miles of uneven ground. Each step ground into my shoulders like a reminder of what they believed, that I wasn't strong enough, not built for this. One blistering afternoon during a field exercise, one of the loudest voices mocking me slipped on a rock and went down with a scream. The crack of his leg breaking echoed across the clearing. For a moment, no one moved. Men who had joked about being invincible stared, unsure whether to intervene or let him call it quits. I didn't hesitate. I was already at his side, kneeling in the mud, wrapping the splint tight, steadying his breath. Then I slung his arm over my shoulder and bore his weight across the field. Step after grueling step. By the time we reached the med tent, sweat stinging my eyes, his expression had changed. No more smirk. When graduation day came, that same soldier, boot still strapped to a brace, was the first to stand and clap when my name was called. At the ceremony, we all stood at rigid attention, dress uniforms immaculate. When the beret was pressed into my hand, the auditorium fell eerily quiet, as if no one quite knew whether to believe what they were seeing. Then a single pair of hands clapped, followed by another, until the entire hall roared with thunderous applause. It should have been triumph, yet as I placed that beret on my head, I felt no surge of pride, no swell of victory, only a cold question gnawing at me. Would this strength ever be enough to save my mother? Years later, when my orders finally allowed me time away, I drove back to Atlanta expecting some piece of home to remain. Instead, I stepped through the front door into a stranger's house. The family photos that once lined the mantel were gone. In their place hung a glossy portrait of my father, Richard Clark, grinning with his arm around a much younger woman, Darlene Whitmore. She was lounging in the living room when I walked in, wearing a pale blue cardigan I had given my mother the Christmas before. She smiled with a slow satisfaction, as if daring me to call it theft. The air reeked of her perfume, cloying and sharp, filling the space where my mother's warmth used to be. And then I saw her. My mother, thinner than I remembered, her skin pale, her shoulders hunched inward. She sat at the dining table, a stack of legal documents spread before her, her hands shaking as she tried to steady a pen. She looked like someone already erased from her own life. My father stood behind her, looming, his voice a hiss. "Sign it. Margaret, stop dragging this out." At the edge of the room, Graham leaned against the wall, arms crossed, avoiding my eyes. When my mother glanced at him, desperate for even a flicker of support, he muttered without emotion, "Just sign it. Mom, let's get this over with." The betrayal sliced deeper than any insult. In that moment, the truth crystallized. This wasn't just my childhood home anymore. It was a battlefield. My father and Darlene were the occupiers, Graham the willing collaborator, and my mother, the only one who had ever tried to shield me, was the hostage. And for the first time, I knew with absolute clarity I was the only one left who could fight for her. The motel sat off the highway, a cheap place that smelled of stale smoke and disinfectant. With curtains so thin, the neon from the gas station outside bled straight into the room. I guided my mother to the edge of the hard mattress, crouched to meet her eyes, and said firmly, "We're not running anymore. We're going to fight." I dragged in a battered whiteboard from the office supply store down the road and turned the dingy room into a war room. Red marker lines slashed across dates. Pushpins marked every incident. Sticky notes layered like battle plans. Each memory became evidence. Every scar, another piece of ammunition. While sorting through the old emails she had once sent me overseas, I froze. In one picture, she proudly showed off her rose bushes, but in the reflection of the windowpane, her face betrayed the truth. A faint bruise on her cheek, caked over with makeup. That accidental capture was stronger than any testimony. The bank statements told the rest of the story. Tens of thousands spent on a Bahamian getaway with Darlene, a Tiffany's necklace, charges disguised as business expenses. This wasn't divorce. This was warfare disguised as paperwork. My father was the hostile force, my mother the captive, and I was stockpiling the proof as our ammunition. Late that night, my mother admitted through trembling hands that twice the neighbors had called the police. Each time, she told the officers it was clumsiness, too afraid to expose him. Hearing her confession cracked the illusion of his invulnerability wide open. For the first time, I saw the shield he had built start to fracture. We carried our thick binder of evidence into offices across Atlanta, only to be met with polished smiles and empty reassurances. The first lawyer flipped through the pages, smirked, and said, "He'll just claim she fell. Cases like this cost a fortune." His retainer fee was higher than my mother had ever seen. The second hardly glanced at the photos, waved off the bank records, and told us it wasn't worth the years it would drag on. By the time we stepped into the hallway, my mother's shoulders collapsed, tears streaking her face. The weight of failure pressed on me too, and for a moment I thought we had lost before we even began. In desperation, I called Sergeant Ellis. His voice came steady as ever. "I know someone." That someone was Patricia Monroe, a former JAG Corps attorney. Her office was nothing like the gleaming towers we had trudged through, just a modest space above a coffee shop, with shelves stacked with worn case files. Patricia sat across from us, studying the binder with the precision of a surgeon. She compared signatures, traced the timelines, and then stopped. Her eyes narrowed as she tapped one page. "Here," she said, sliding it closer. My father had transferred the deed of the house into a shell company under Darlene's name, forging my mother's signature with clumsy strokes. Then she turned to the divorce petition itself. Buried in the fine print was a clause where my mother was to waive all rights to that same company. Patricia leaned back, a cold smile tugging at her lips. "He wasn't just arrogant, he was careless. He handed us both the gun and the bullet. Now all we need to do is pull the trigger." The fluorescent lights above the Fulton County courtroom buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glare across the worn wood that smelled of damp and years of sweat and polish. I sat perfectly still, every sense sharpened, as the heavy doors opened and my father strode in. Richard Clark wore a suit that didn't quite fit, fabric pulling across his shoulders, but he carried himself with the swagger of a man convinced the room belonged to him. At his side, his attorney strutted with too much hair gel and not enough conscience, their confidence radiating like cheap cologne. They took their seats opposite my mother, who sat hunched, her fingers trembling around the pen she had been forced to hold for weeks. My father leaned close, his lips curling with contempt. "Sign it," he hissed, low enough for most to miss, but sharp enough to cut her in half. She shook her head slightly, tears pooling in her eyes. His jaw clenched. And then, without hesitation, he struck her. The crack of palm against skin exploded through the chamber like a gunshot. The bailiff froze. The clerk stopped mid-keystroke. The judge's mouth parted in disbelief. Every spectator drew in the same sharp breath at once, and the silence that followed was so total, it seemed even the old building held its breath. My mother's cheek burned red, her body rigid, but she did not cry out. I rose, slowly, deliberately. The legs of my chair scraped against the floor. I removed the green beret from my head and set it down on the table before me. The sound was small but final, a gavel in miniature. My voice carried steady and clear. "Your Honor, please turn to the last page." Every eye swung toward me. The judge's gaze sharpened behind his glasses, and even the attorney, who moments earlier had smirked, now frowned in sudden unease. My father whipped around, confusion flashing, color draining from his face as if he already sensed the noose tightening. No one else in that room knew it yet, but I had come armed. The page I pointed to was no mere formality. It was his own confession buried in legalese, the weapon he had signed with arrogance. And as the judge reached for the file, the room seemed to tilt, charged with the inevitability of what was about to come. The courtroom held its breath as Patricia Monroe rose to her feet, binder in hand. With crisp precision, she laid out the case piece by piece, photographs of bruises half hidden beneath makeup, police reports neighbors had filed, bank statements showing tens of thousands wasted on trips and jewelry. Each exhibit hit like a hammer blow, stripping away my father's mask. When I was called to testify, I delivered every fact the way I had been trained on the field. Direct, clipped, without flourish, dates, injuries, expenditures. My voice carried no emotion, only the steady cadence of a soldier reporting casualties. Then Patricia turned to the final page of the divorce petition, her voice ringing through the hushed chamber. She highlighted the clause where my mother was to waive all rights to the shell company, exposing the forged signature and the concealed property transfer. The room shifted. My father's lawyer paled, fumbling for words that would not come. My father erupted, his face purple, veins straining at his neck. "You traitor! I'll kill you!" he roared, lunging across the aisle. Before he could reach me, two bailiffs moved in, slamming him to the ground. The judge's gavel thundered. "Richard Clark, you are under arrest for assault, fraud, and forgery." And just like that, the empire he had built on fear collapsed in front of everyone. Back in the house that finally belonged to her. The air felt lighter, no longer heavy with dread. My mother tore down the photo of my father and his mistress, shattered the frame, and tossed it away. She painted the door robin's egg blue, laid a new mat that read "Hello Sunshine," and filled the kitchen with the warm scent of cinnamon and apple pie, a dessert he had once forbidden. I watched her laugh, unrestrained, for the first time in 3 decades. Months later, she was shaping clay in a pottery class, volunteering at a women's shelter, giving others the strength she had reclaimed. When I left, the laughter and the fragrance of apples followed me out the door, proof that true justice was not my father in handcuffs, but my mother free to choose her life again.